Okay, in this tutorial, I'm going to explain to you the formation of an oxbow lake. And if we just have a quick little look at the revision checklist, you'll see it comes under the formation of erosional depositional features in river landscapes, oxbow lake. Now, very similar to the waterfall, you need to be able to potentially draw a diagram to help show this. Now, just like with the meander, the question is either going to say you may wish or explain with the aid. Now, if it says you may, then it's up to you whether you draw a diagram or not. If it doesn't say you may but asks you to use the aid of a diagram, then you must. But what does that really mean? Well, just as with the meander, if we have a little look at a diagram, here's a nice little sequence diagram, ABCD. If you simply drew a blue line like this with a little kind of horseshoe-shaped part of the river and labeled it Oxbow Lake, and that was it, that would count as your diagram, and you could therefore get the full range of marks. If you want to draw a more complex diagram with lots of annotations, then look into your class notes, and it will show you the way to approach drawing a diagram that would allow you to get full marks without having to write an answer. What I'm now going to do, though, is explain to you how to write an answer for the Oxbow Lake. So what you can see here is a river winding its way across a very flat landscape with lots of meanders, with river cliffs and slip-off slopes, where the river is moving from side to side. And here we have a very thin neck. And what's kind of obvious is at some point the river is going to just, because this is an outside bend here, and over here we have an outside bend, there's going to be continual erosion. So this little thin neck of land is going to burst through, and the water coming down here is almost all entirely just going to flow directly down here with very little going around this channel. And eventually this will become cut off and become a large oxbow lake. Like we can see in this next example, where the river, we can see, used to flow round here and all the way around the loop and then flow back in. But at some point it burst through the channel, and then lots of sediment's been dumped across the mouths of the old meander, and now it's cut off like an oxbow lake. So let's get down to explaining how this happens. We'll do this through a diagram. So the first thing to tell me, the formation of an oxbow lake happens when the landscape has become very flat and the river is near the sea, so it's in its lower course. And because of that, the river has started to do far more lateral erosion, moving side to side, forming meanders. It's also starting to lose a lot of energy because it's now on a much flatter landscape near sea level, and therefore it's more likely to be depositing material. Okay, so that's stage one. We've got a mark for talking about lateral erosion because the river is on a much flatter landscape. Stage two is to say that the river, as it moves laterally across the landscape, starts to meander. And this is because it's flowing between pools and riffles, and which encourage the river to flow in a helicoidal flow from side to side. And that this encourages the fastest current to flow to one side, which increases the rate of erosion on that side, and deposition on the slower flowing side. Now, as soon as you talk about the rate of erosion, you want to then say this can happen through abrasion, which is where rocks in the river channel are pushed against the outside and chip away at the river bank and riverbed, making it deeper and wider on this side because of abrasion. And also because of hydraulic action, where the water, the fast flowing water, gets into cracks in the riverbank, compresses air, which puts more pressure on those cracks, weakening them until eventually the riverbank collapses. And this creates a riverbank on the outside bend. On the opposite, on the inside bend, you have a slower flowing river with less energy, creating the slip-off slope. So what you're telling me here is the same thing that you did with the meander. You're giving me the explanation for the erosion creating the river cliff and the deposition creating the slip-off slope. As soon as you mention erosion, you must mention hydraulic action and abrasion, and you must tell me what those two mean. And you want to tell me that the river beach is created by river deposition because the river is running out of energy. Now, at this point, you've got half of your meander answer, and this is where you stop. And you start now moving into the oxbow lake. What you want to say is, over time, the river cliff will begin to move in one direction because of erosion happening on the outside bend, and the slip-off slope will be pushing towards it. So your river starts to, the meander starts to become more and more pronounced. And that's the key thing. Because of the movement of the meanders with more erosion on one side, more deposition on the other, your meander is becoming more and more pronounced. So you can see that here it's less curvy, and here it's becoming very curvy. Next step is to tell me that over time, two outside bends will start to get closer towards each other, creating a thin neck between the two outsides of the river bends. Eventually, and normally during a flood period where the river has far more energy, the river will break through this neck, and we can see this in the third diagram, eroding away the neck completely and forming a new channel, with the old channel still having water pushed around it. Now, what will happen very quickly is, because this is the easiest route, the new channel is the easiest route for water to flow because it's more direct, less water is going to get pushed around the old channel. What that means is that the speed of flow in the old channel will be significantly less. And because there's less flow, the river will tend to drop most of its material in the old channel because there's very little water flowing through it now. What that means, or what that results in, is the old channel starts to get sediment starts to build up until eventually it gets completely cut off as basically a large river beach builds up, forming a new riverbank, which we can see in this last diagram. The old river meander has now become an oxbow lake, which may often dry up if it's not being fed by another river and becomes an oxbow scar, which will then be overgrown by vegetation and will eventually be almost invisible to the, unless you're flying over it in a plane. You don't need to mention this, but certainly by getting the oxbow scar in, you pick up another point for explaining, or certainly if you explain how the oxbow scar forms, because the old meander dries up and there's nothing feeding it with water anymore. Okay, so that's an explanation for the Oxbow Lake. Key points in it, just to remind you, are mentioning abrasion hydraulic action on the outside of the river bends, mentioning about the slower flow on the inside, talking about how the river bends become more pronounced, explaining how a thin neck forms between two outsides of the river bend, explaining how during a river flood, when the river's got more energy, it will break through that neck, then explaining how very little water gets pushed around the old river channel, because most of the river water will take the more direct route. Because less water is going around this old river channel, it'll start to drop its sediment, and the sediment will build up until eventually the old river channel is blocked up, creating an oxbow lake, which may dry up to form an oxbow scar.